He trained 18 legends. Every one of them died. Not in old age, not in bed. They died within 9 days of each other, on the same collapsing front, and he watched almost all of it from a ridge 3 kilometers away with a spyglass in his hand. They died doing exactly what he taught them. He had taught them to fight. He had never taught them to survive. Then he died too, last, alone, holding a broken training token with one thought left. I would do it differently. 200 years earlier, a failing instructor at the worst academy in the kingdom woke up in a rented room the size of a closet with a stranger's face in the mirror. This time, he picked different students. The end of the world doesn't look dramatic when you're standing above it. That's the first thing nobody tells you. From high enough up, an army dying looks like a slow tide going out. There's no music, no swelling drums. There's just movement in a direction that shouldn't be happening, and the awful patience of it, and the fact that you can see the entire thing at once and cannot reach any part of it. He was on the ridge because that's where a commander is supposed to be. He had argued against it. He had lost that argument to men with more medals and less experience, which is how most catastrophes begin if you trace them far enough back. The greatest living instructor of his generation put on a rock with a spyglass, 3 kilometers from everyone he loved. Below him, the line was coming apart. The first of his students to die was the one who could not retreat. He'd been like that since he was 15, a red-haired boy with bandaged hands who treated every backward step as a personal accusation. There was a thing that happened behind his eyes when he was told to fall back, a shutter coming down, and after that you could shout at him all day and he would not hear a word of it. The instructor had loved that about him. That's the part that came back later, over and over, in the years when there was nothing left to do but remember. He had loved it. He called it spirit. He praised it in front of the other students, held it up as an example of what the rest of them should aspire to. And every time he praised it, the boy dug in a little harder the next time, because praise from that man was the only currency the boy had ever cared about in his entire life. So when the eastern flank broke, and the correct answer, the obvious answer, the answer any second-year cadet could have given you in their sleep, was to withdraw 400 meters and reform behind the ridgeline, that boy planted his feet. He held. He was very good at holding. It was the thing he was best at in the world. He was still holding when the ground underneath him stopped existing. The second was the healer. She had never once in her life been able to leave someone bleeding. Not in training exercises, not in field drills, not when it was tactically correct, not when she was directly ordered, not when the person bleeding was wearing an enemy uniform. There was a wall somewhere inside her, and on the other side of that wall was a decision she simply could not make. She went forward into a burning street, past the point where forward stops being a direction you can come back from. She went because there was noise in there, and noise meant people, and people meant she had to. She got 2 of them out, 2 soldiers, both of whom survived the war, and neither of whom ever spoke about that day in public for the rest of their lives. She did not get herself out. The third was the one who wouldn't ask, and this one is the one that broke him, because she could have called. That's the thing that sat in his chest for the rest of his life, and then followed him past the end of it. There were 3 units inside her range. Any one of them would have dropped what they were doing and come at a dead run because of what she had become to them over the years. She was the reason half of those people were still breathing. All she had to do was open a channel and say 4 words. She didn't. She hadn't asked anyone for anything since she was 17 years old. Since the first time she trusted a person with something that mattered, and that person turned around and sold her position to a rival house for an amount of money that wasn't even large. It wasn't a fortune. It was a middling sum, paid quietly, and it cost her the last part of herself that could reach outward. After that, she removed the entire category of asking from her life, the way you'd pull a tooth that hurt, completely, permanently, and without discussing it with anyone. So she went down alone, beneath a thing that 4 people working together would have handled in under a minute, 300 meters from help that would have come running if she had made one single sound. And the instructor stood on that ridge and watched it happen, and understood the exact shape of what he had done. Every one of them had a flaw, every single one. and every one of those flaws he had personally found, sharpened, polished, and handed back to them. Because in a training hall, in a controlled fight, on a scoring sheet, those flaws all look like strengths. Refusing to retreat looks like courage. Refusing to abandon the wounded looks like loyalty. Refusing to ask for help looks like independence. None of those things are courage. They are the same fear wearing different clothes. It took him 18 funerals to understand that, and by then there was nobody left to explain it to. When the sky broke, and it did break, that isn't a figure of speech, there was a crack in it, and light came through that was the wrong color entirely, a color that hurt to look at directly. He was already on his knees. Not from a wound, from the weight of it. He had a token in his fist, the little bronze disc every student receives on their first day at any academy in the kingdom, stamped with the year and the school and nothing else. 18 of those discs had been handed out by that hand. He had made a small ceremony of it every single time because he believed it mattered, and he had been right about that if nothing else. The token snapped. He felt it go, the clean, bright crack of it against his palm. Then the light came down, and then he was somewhere else. He woke up choking, not from a wound, from air. His lungs pulled in a breath his body wasn't braced for, and he came off the mattress hard, hands out, expecting stone underneath him and finding a thin bed frame that creaked in protest. The room was the size of a storage closet, peeling wallpaper, one narrow window with gray light in it, the smell of damp and someone else's sweat that had been living in those walls for years. He sat there breathing for a long time. The face in the mirror was wrong. Younger, first of all, late 30s instead of the 62 he had been carrying around, but the wrong kind of younger. Thin in a way that spoke of skipped meals rather than discipline. Dark hair going gray at the temples about 10 years too early. A thin scar cutting through the left eyebrow that he had not earned and did not remember getting. He knew the face, though. That's what made his hands go cold. He'd seen it exactly once. Decades ago, and also 200 years from now, in a corridor at a small academy he had visited one time for a review he had been ordered to attend and wanted no part of. The man in that mirror had been a joke. Not a cruel man, not a scandal, just absent. An instructor at the bottom-tier academy where the kingdom sent students nobody else would take, and a bad instructor even by that standard. He turned up, he said words, he went home. He collected a wage that barely covered the room the instructor was currently standing in. On the table by the window sat a stack of unpaid bills. He counted them without meaning to. 3 months. And on the wall, a paper calendar with a year printed across the top. He read the year, and the recognition landed in his chest like cold water going down. 204 years before the war. Which meant that everyone who was going to die in that war had not yet been born, with a very small number of exceptions. A handful of people who, at this exact moment, on this exact morning, were children. He sat down on the edge of the bed and did not move for a long time. Let's be honest about the assets. He had a body with no measurable mana capacity, in its late 30s, undertrained and underfed, with a cough already living somewhere at the bottom of the lungs. He had a job he could lose on any given morning. He had a reputation somewhere below the floorboards. No money, no allies, no name that would open a single door anywhere in the kingdom. And he had this. 200 years of combat experience burned so deep into the mind that it had survived being carried across death itself. Every technique he had ever learned, every technique he had ever invented, every mistake he had ever made, cataloged and understood and turned over so many times in the dark that the edges had gone smooth, and a complete, precise, unbearable memory of a future that had not happened yet. He walked to the academy that morning because he genuinely did not know what else to do with his hands. The building was worse than he remembered. Corridors that hadn't seen paint in a generation. Windows with the putty crumbling out of the frames. A brass nameplate beside a door with a stranger's name on it, his name now, mounted crooked, and nobody in that entire building had cared enough about the man behind that door to straighten it in years. That detail told him more about the life he had inherited than the unpaid bills had. The office had dust on the desk thick enough to write in. He found the roster in the second drawer, underneath a stack of forms nobody had ever filed. Third-year remedial group, the class they give to the instructor they don't respect, made up of the students nobody will fight over. 3 names. He read the first one and stopped breathing. He knew it. Everyone in the world he came from knew it. It belonged to a woman who, 22 years from that morning, would burn a city down to its foundation stones and stand in the middle of it while it burned. It took 4 nations working together, setting aside 100 years of mutual grievance to finally bring her down. There are 3 separate holidays in 3 separate countries that exist because of what she did. He was looking at her name on a list of failing students. 15 years old, attending the worst class at the worst academy in the kingdom because nowhere else would take her. He read the second name, a boy who would grow up to hold a line he should have abandoned and die there and be given a statue for it in a square that no longer exists. He read the third, a healer who would walk into a burning street and not come back out. His hand closed on the paper hard enough to crease it down the middle. 15, all 3 of them. Nothing had happened to them yet. The betrayal that hollowed the first one out, that was 6 years away. It hadn't happened. The person who did it to her had not yet even met her. They were, at that moment, some anonymous young man in a merchant family 2 provinces over, going about his day. The war was 2 centuries out, and the other 2 were only in it because of who they became in the decades between now and then, and none of those decades had been lived. None of it was written yet. He stood up from that desk, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, the thing sitting in his chest was not grief. He went to the window. Below him, on a dirt field that needed resurfacing, a group of teenagers was going through the first form badly, without supervision, because nobody had come out to watch them. He stood at that window for a long time, and he thought about the fact that he had been given something almost nobody in the history of the world has ever been given. Not power, not a second chance at greatness, a second chance to be wrong differently. The classroom held 3 students and enough empty chairs for 30. The girl with the crimson eyes sat at the back with her feet up on the desk. Long black hair, loose, not tied back the way regulations required, and clearly not for the first time. She watched him come in with the flat, bored contempt of someone who has already run the calculation and concluded that nothing in this room is going to matter. She was, by an enormous margin, the strongest 15-year-old in that building. Everyone knew it, including her, and it had done exactly nothing for her except make her alone. The red-haired boy sat at the front, hands and forearms wrapped in bandages that were not from combat drills. They were from the wall behind the training hall. He hit that wall when he lost. He lost frequently. Nobody had ever asked him to stop, and nobody had ever asked him why, and both of those facts were in his file with no comment attached. The blonde girl sat as far from both of them as the room physically allowed, in the white and pale blue of a healer's uniform, with the particular stillness of a person trying to occupy as little space in the world as they can manage. 3 children written off by every adult who had ever stood in front of them. He didn't introduce himself. He walked to the desk, dropped a bronze training token onto it, and the sound it made in that quiet room was very loud. "Today," he said, "you're going to lose." The girl at the back laughed at him, out loud. It wasn't even hostile. It was the honest laugh of someone hearing something genuinely funny for the first time in a while. 20 minutes later, all 3 of them were flat on their backs on the training field, and nobody was laughing. He hadn't used mana. He didn't have any worth the name. That hadn't changed and wasn't going to. What he had was 200 years of knowing precisely where a 15-year-old shifts their weight in the half second before they commit to a strike. That, it turns out, is enough. It's more than enough. It's almost unfair. The red-haired boy went first, because of course he did. Straight in, hard and honest and completely without deception, and the instructor stepped inside the line of it and put him on the ground in under 2 seconds. The boy got up, did it again. Same opening, same result. Third time, same. The healer wouldn't attack at all at first. She stood at the edge of the circle with her hands at her sides and her weight on her back foot. He waited. He didn't prompt her, didn't encourage her, didn't make it easier. She came eventually, badly, apologizing the entire way in a small voice, and he put her down gently, and she stayed down, looking up at the sky like it had personally betrayed her. And then the girl with the crimson eyes came at him, and she was, genuinely, alarmingly, good. He felt it the instant she moved. That raw ceiling, the thing that would one day terrify 4 nations, already sitting there in the shoulders of a 15-year-old. If she had 5 more years and any structure at all, he would have been in serious trouble. She also went down, because talent with no structure is speed pointed in the wrong direction, and he had been correcting that specific error since before her great-grandparents were born. They lay in the dirt, all 3 of them, furious and humiliated, and beginning to understand that the humiliation was not going to stop. And then he did the thing that none of their previous instructors had ever done. He held out his hand. The red-haired boy stared at it like it was a trap with a mechanism he couldn't see, looked at his face, looked back at the hand, then took it. They went again. They lost again. He offered his hand again, and again, and again, and again, until the sun was going down and all 3 of them were too tired to lift their arms, and the anger had burned off somewhere around the 20th repetition. Because it turns out that you cannot sustain rage that long against someone who keeps helping you back up. That was the entire first lesson. Not a technique, not a stance, not one single correction to their form, which was, frankly, terrible across the board. Losing, getting up, and letting someone else help you do it. Here's why. And this is the thing he could not explain to them, then or ever. Every one of his 18 legends had died alone in a crowd. Not one of them died because they lacked skill. They died in the specific gap that opens between people who have never practiced needing each other. The boy who wouldn't fall back had 2 units behind him. The healer had an entire squad who would have carried her out. The girl had 3 units in range. They all died surrounded by help they had never learned how to take. So he didn't start with sword work. He started with the hand. By the time it was fully dark, the 3 of them were sitting in the dirt in a rough circle, breathing, and he was sitting with them, and nobody had said anything for a while. The girl with the crimson eyes broke it. "You're not going to explain what that was about." It wasn't a question. She didn't ask questions. "No," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he recognized immediately and hated seeing on someone that young. The careful, guarded calculation of a person working out whether an adult is worth the risk of having expectations about. Then she got up, dusted herself off, and walked away without another word. And she came back the next morning. All 3 of them came back. That was the part he hadn't been certain of, lying awake the night before doing arithmetic in the dark. 3 students, in a class nobody checked attendance for, at an academy where nobody would have said anything if they'd simply stopped. They came back, and that was the first thing that hadn't happened in the old world. Here's the thing about knowing the future. It is not a weapon. Mostly it's a map of every place you already failed, drawn in detail, and handed back to you with the corners neatly squared. So he built each lesson around a death. The red-haired boy needed to learn to retreat, not tactically. The boy understood retreat perfectly well as an abstract concept, could explain it on paper, could identify the correct moment for it while watching someone else. What he could not do was make his own feet perform it, because somewhere early in his life he had learned that a step backward and being worthless were the same event. So the instructor made retreating the entire curriculum. Drills where the only pass condition was giving ground, sparring where any forward step was an instant loss, exercises where the boy had to cross the whole field backward under pressure, and the pressure did not stop, and there was no version of the exercise where planting his feet worked. The boy hated it with a purity that was almost admirable. He argued, he sulked, he accused the instructor twice of trying to make him a coward on purpose, which was, in a limited sense, accurate. He walked off the field entirely on 2 separate occasions, and both times came back within the hour, which told the instructor everything he needed to know about the boy and never needed to say out loud. And then, one ordinary afternoon, mid-exchange, with nobody having said anything, he gave ground. 3 clean steps back, resetting his stance, blade still up, eyes still forward. Then he blinked, visibly, like a man who had just caught himself speaking a language he never learned. The instructor said nothing at all. You don't announce a thing like that. You let it belong to them or it isn't theirs. The healer needed to learn to touch a wound, which sounds absurd for a girl wearing a healer's uniform. It wasn't. She could mend a fractured bone from across a room. Her theory scores were the highest in her year, and it was not close. She was, on paper, the most gifted student in that building after the girl with the crimson eyes. What she could not do was put her hands on someone who was actively bleeding in front of her. Because the first time she ever tried, at 11 years old, on someone she loved very much, it hadn't worked. And she had been holding on when it stopped mattering. He didn't lecture her about it. He had tried lecturing people about things like this for 200 years, and it had never once worked on anybody. He took out a knife and cut his own hand. A shallow, unimpressive line across the palm, enough to bleed properly, not enough to matter. And he held it out, and he waited. She stood there for a very long time, long enough that blood ran off the edge of his hand and started dotting the floorboards between them. He kept waiting. He was extremely good at waiting. He had 2 centuries of practice and absolutely nowhere else to be. She put her fingers on the cut. Her whole arm was shaking hard enough that he could feel it through his own hand. She held on anyway. The wound closed. Clean, fast, better work than anything in her file suggested. And she made a small sound that was not quite crying and not quite anything else. He wrapped his hand, said, "Again tomorrow," and left the room before she could see his face. He did it again the next day. And the day after that. 11 days in a row, the same shallow cut on the same palm, until the day she took his hand and turned it over without being asked and got to work while still complaining about the weather. And then there was the girl with the crimson eyes, and hers was the hard one, because she had to learn to ask for help. That was the flaw. That was the whole thing. That was what turned a brilliant, isolated 15-year-old into something 4 nations had to combine forces to put down. She trusted exactly once, at 17, and it was sold. Afterwards, she removed asking from her life and kept removing, year after year, decade after decade, until there was nothing left inside her but capability and distance. You cannot teach a person to ask by telling them to ask. Telling her would have guaranteed she never did it again as long as she lived, out of pure spite, and she had enough spite to run on for a century. So he gave her tasks that were impossible alone. Not difficult. Impossible. Weights one person cannot physically shift. Formations one caster cannot hold open. Exercises built around a hard mathematical requirement of 2 sets of hands, designed specifically so that no amount of talent or stubbornness could close the gap. She failed the first one in silence and wouldn't look at anyone for the rest of the day. She failed the second one and put her fist through a training dummy afterward, which the instructor quietly repaired that night and never mentioned to anyone. She failed the third and then stood alone in the middle of the field for a full minute with her hands shaking at her sides while the light went orange around her. He watched from the edge and did not intervene, and it was one of the hardest things he had ever done, because he knew precisely what waited at the end of that road if she never learned this. And on the 4th attempt, without a word, without turning her head, without any change of expression at all, she held one hand out sideways toward the red-haired boy. He took it immediately, like he'd been waiting weeks for it, which he had. They finished the exercise in 11 seconds. She stood there afterwards staring at her own hand with an expression the instructor would remember for the rest of that life. Complete, undefended confusion. As though the hand had acted on its own authority and she could not work out what it had just done to her. That evening, alone in his office with one candle, he took out a list he had written on his first day. 3 names, beside each one, in small letters, the thing that killed them. He drew a single line through the first entry. Then he sat in the dark for a while and did not feel triumphant. Because he was also doing the other arithmetic. The one about what happens to 200 years of downstream events when you reach in at the root and change 3 lives. He had just started breaking the future on purpose. He had no idea yet how much of it was going to break. An academy is a machine for producing a specific kind of person, and machines do not enjoy being reconfigured by a man in a coat with frayed cuffs. The complaints started small, the way they always do. His methods were unorthodox, his students weren't drilling the standard forms in the standard order. He had been observed on the training field losing to 15-year-olds, repeatedly, deliberately, which somehow made it worse rather than better in the retelling. Then the results started arriving, and that was the actual problem. His 3 remedial students beat a second-year group in a scheduled exercise. Not a fluke, the report said so specifically, in a tone of considerable irritation. 2 weeks later they beat another one, and they didn't do it spectacularly. That was the part the instructors couldn't process. There was no display of overwhelming power, no prodigy moment, nothing you could point at in a report and circle. They simply kept doing the correct thing at the correct moment, while their opponents kept doing the impressive thing slightly too early. Which is, if you think about it for more than a second, considerably more alarming. That's when the silver-haired girl walked into his office. Shoulder-length silver hair, cold, pale blue eyes, black uniform with gold insignia at the collar, top student of the academy by every measure they had, heir to a military house old enough that several of the kingdom's borders were, in a fairly direct sense, their fault. 17 years old, carrying herself with the absolute composure of a person who has never once been embarrassed in public and has no framework for imagining what that would even be like. She wanted a demonstration match, her class against his, 6 against 3. She did not phrase it as a challenge. She phrased it as a courtesy, a quiet way of ending an embarrassment before the instructors' council ended it loudly, at his expense, in front of everyone. And the worst part, the part that told him exactly who she was and exactly what her own flaw would eventually cost her, is that she meant it completely sincerely. In her mind, she was being kind. He accepted before she finished the sentence. The arena was full. An academy is a machine for producing a specific kind of person, and machines do not enjoy being reconfigured by a man in a coat with frayed cuffs. The complaints started small, the way they always do. His methods were unorthodox. His students weren't drilling the standard forms in the standard order. He had been observed on the training field losing to 15-year-olds, repeatedly, deliberately, which somehow made it worse rather than better in the retelling. Then the results started arriving, and that was the actual problem. His 3 remedial students beat a second-year group in a scheduled exercise. Not a fluke, the report said so specifically, in a tone of considerable irritation. 2 weeks later they beat another one, and they didn't do it spectacularly. That was the part the instructors couldn't process. There was no display of overwhelming power, no prodigy moment, nothing you could point at in a report and circle. They simply kept doing the correct thing at the correct moment, while their opponents kept doing the impressive thing slightly too early. Which is, if you think about it for more than a second, considerably more alarming. That's when the silver-haired girl walked into his office. Shoulder-length silver hair, cold pale blue eyes, black uniform with gold insignia at the collar. Top student of the academy by every measure they had. Heir to a military house old enough that several of the kingdom's borders were, in a fairly direct sense, their fault. 17 years old, carrying herself with the absolute composure of a person who has never once been embarrassed in public and has no framework for imagining what that would even be like. She wanted a demonstration match, her class against his, 6 against 3. She did not phrase it as a challenge. She phrased it as a courtesy, a quiet way of ending an embarrassment before the instructors' council ended it loudly, at his expense, in front of everyone. And the worst part, the part that told him exactly who she was and exactly what her own flaw would eventually cost her, is that she meant it completely sincerely. In her mind, she was being kind. He accepted before she finished the sentence. The arena was full. That surprised him. He had underestimated how badly the academy wanted to watch this. The stands were packed with students who had spent an entire term hearing rumors about the strange remedial class, and every instructor in the building had found a reason to be there, and they had all come for the same thing. His 3 students stood in the middle of all that noise, 15 years old, looking very, very small. He watched from the upper gallery with both hands on the stone rail so nobody could see them. The signal sounded. The first opponent came in hard and fast at the red-haired boy, a big second year with reach and confidence, opening with exactly the kind of committed, aggressive charge that would have ended this in 3 seconds 6 months earlier. The boy would have met it head-on. He'd have lost badly and hit a wall about it afterward. He gave ground. 3 clean steps back in that tight arc, blade up. The opponent, committed to a collision that had just stopped existing, stumbled through empty air with all his weight in front of him. And the girl with the crimson eyes was already in the gap. Because they had drilled that specific gap 400 times. Because retreat is not retreat when someone else is standing exactly where the enemy is about to be. 6 became 5, and the noise in the stands changed pitch. The healer held a barrier a 15-year-old had no business holding. Not a spectacular one. A wide, low, unglamorous shield that wasn't there to win anything, only to buy 2 seconds at a time and then 2 more. Her hands were steady, her eyes were open. There was a boy bleeding 3 meters away from her, and she was not frozen. She was working. And underneath all of it, quietly, she was talking. A low, steady stream of nonsense that nobody in the stands could hear, and that the person on the ground in front of her could. 5 became 4, then 3. And then the silver-haired girl stepped forward herself, and the arena went quiet in the way an arena goes quiet when 600 people all realize the same thing at the same moment. She put all 3 of them on the ground with one technique. It wasn't close, it wasn't dramatic. There was a flash, and a sound like a very heavy door slamming somewhere much larger than the building you're standing in, and then there were 3 15-year-olds lying in the sand and a great deal of dust in the air. Up in the stands, people began standing up to leave. The girl with the crimson eyes got up. Nobody had told her to. There was no signal, no shouted instruction, nothing left to prove and nothing to be gained. She got up with one arm hanging wrong and blood at her mouth, and she looked across that arena at the strongest student in the academy for about a second and a half. And then she turned and held her hand out to the boy on the ground beside her. 600 people watched her do it. He took it. He got up. Then the 2 of them turned together and pulled the healer up off the sand, and the 3 of them stood in a rough line in the middle of that arena, and nobody in the stands sat back down. What happened in the next 9 seconds is still argued about by people who were there. They didn't win. Let's be honest about that, because the story doesn't need the lie. 3 battered 15-year-olds did not defeat the strongest student in the academy. But the boy gave ground in that tight, aggressive arc and drew the follow-up exactly where he wanted it, and did not flinch when it came. And the healer's barrier came up half a second before it was needed instead of half a second after, because she had stopped bracing herself first. And the girl with the crimson eyes went into a gap that existed only because 2 other people had made it for her, and she went into it without hesitating, which 6 months ago she could not have done, because 6 months ago she would not have believed the gap would still be there when she arrived. When the dust settled, the silver-haired girl was on one knee. Her uniform was intact. She wasn't seriously hurt. She was back on her feet within seconds, and the match was called in her favor, correctly and without argument from anyone. And the arena was completely silent. Because every person in that building had just watched the top student of the academy forced onto one knee by 3 remedial 15-year-olds. And more importantly, they had all seen how. There was nothing there to copy. No secret technique, no hidden bloodline, no revelation. 3 children had simply refused to fight alone. Up in the instructor's gallery, a man in a worn coat with frayed cuffs stood watching with his hand shaking on the rail, and it had nothing at all to do with pride. He had just watched the girl who burns a city hold her hand out to someone. In public. In front of 600 witnesses. On her own initiative, with nobody telling her to and nothing to gain from it. That was the moment he knew the old future was gone. And that should have been the happiest moment of 2 lifetimes. It was not, entirely, because a man who has spent 200 years studying consequences cannot watch a fixed point come loose without immediately wondering what else is attached to it. She came to his office 4 days after the arena. Not immediately. That was the first thing that told him something about her. A person who wants an explanation comes the next morning, while the humiliation is still hot. A person who wants to understand takes 4 days, and arrives having already thought about it more than anyone else has. She knocked. That was the second thing. Nobody in that building knocked on his door. Shoulder-length silver hair, black uniform, gold at the collar, standing in a doorway of an office with dust in the corners, and a stack of graded exercise sheets on a chair, because there was nowhere else to put them. "I won," she said. "You did," he agreed. The match was called in my favor, correctly. It was. She stood there for a moment, and he watched her arrive at the thing she had come to say, and find that she could not quite get it out, which was, he suspected, an entirely new experience for her. He decided to help. "You want to know why it doesn't feel like it," he said. She didn't answer, which was an answer. He moved the exercise sheets off the chair. She didn't sit down. But she came into the room, which was the same thing. 600 people watched you put 3 15-year-olds on the ground with one technique, he said. By any measure that exists at this academy, you were flawless. And every single person who left that arena was talking about them. Yes. Do you know why? Because it was novel. Flat. Rehearsed. She had clearly built that answer over 4 days and was not satisfied with it, which is why she was standing in his office. No, he said. It's because you fought a battle and they fought together. Those are not the same activity, and everybody in that building could see it, including you. She looked at him for a long moment. You're going to tell me I need friends, she said. There was a specific contempt in it, the contempt of someone who has been handed that particular platitude by well-meaning adults since she was 6 years old. No, he said. I'm going to tell you something worse. He leaned back. You've never needed anyone, not once, not in your entire life. Everything that has ever been asked of you, you have been able to do alone, and you've been trained since childhood to treat that as the highest possible achievement, which means you've never developed the thing those 3 children built in 4 months, which is the absolute certainty that when you move into a gap, someone will be holding it open when you get there. He watched that land. It landed slowly. It landed the way things land on people who are used to understanding everything immediately. That girl, he said, went into a space that only existed because 2 other people made it for her, and she went in without checking. Not without looking, without checking. Do you understand the difference? Yes. Very quiet. Then you understand what you don't have. She was silent for a while. Outside, somewhere, an instructor was shouting a count for a drill. That's not a weakness, she said at last. Being able to do it alone is not a weakness. It isn't, he agreed. It's the most useful thing in the world, right up until the day it isn't, and on that day it kills you. And the terrible part is that you'll never see that day coming, because everything before it will have proven you right. Something moved across her face then. Not agreement, recognition of a different kind. The kind you get when a stranger describes a thing you have privately worried about at 3 a.m. and never said aloud to anyone. He had, of course, been describing a specific death. Hers. Which he had watched from a ridge, 200 years and 1 lifetime from that room, in the 9th day of a war that had not been declared yet. She had gone down alone, too. Late in the collapse, holding a position that 4 people could have held comfortably, refusing to fall back to a line where there was support. Not out of pride at the end, out of habit. She had simply never learned that the other option existed. He did not say any of that. Teach me, she said, and that was the moment he understood what he was actually dealing with. Not arrogance, not entitlement. A 17-year-old who had just discovered a gap in herself and moved to close it inside 4 days, which is faster than almost any adult he had ever trained. No, he said. Her jaw tightened. Why? Because you don't need a teacher. There is nothing I can show you about technique that you can't find yourself inside a month. You're better than I am, in the only way that matters here, and both of us know it. Then what do I need? He was quiet for a moment, because the honest answer was going to cost her something, and because he had spent 200 years learning that this is exactly when you say it. You need to lose, he said, properly, to someone you can't dismiss, repeatedly, in front of people, until it stops meaning what you currently think it means. That's not a lesson, that's just failure. It's the only lesson there is. Everything else is decoration. She stared at him. You made them lose, she said slowly. On purpose. That's what you were doing on that field. That's what the whole first month was. Yes. That's why they got up. A pause. That's why they got up together. Yes. She stood in the middle of that dusty office and did the arithmetic, and he watched her do it, and he could see the exact moment she understood that the demonstration match she had arranged as a kindness had been, from his side, a final examination, and that his 3 students had passed it in front of 600 witnesses. She turned to leave. At the door, she stopped. "You're not what you look like," she said. It wasn't a question. "A man who could see that in a 15-year-old doesn't end up here." He said nothing at all. She looked at him for one more second, cold, pale eyes doing something he didn't like, which was thinking carefully, and then she left, and the door clicked shut behind her. He sat in the quiet for a long time afterward. Because he had come back into this world with a very specific plan, and that plan had involved being invisible, and he had just been looked at properly by the most dangerous 17-year-old on the island, and because of what she'd asked for. In the world he came from, she died alone at the end of a war that took everyone. In this one, she had walked into a stranger's office 4 days after her first public defeat and asked to be taught. He had wanted to change 3 lives. The number was going up. That night, he coughed blood into a handkerchief in a dark office. He looked at it for a while, then folded the cloth carefully, put it in his coat pocket, and went back to marking exercise sheets, because there was nothing else useful to do with the information, and the sheets still needed marking. The body he was living in had never been strong. That much had been obvious from the first morning. What he had been doing since then was driving it, every day, at an output it was never built to produce. Not raw power. He didn't have any. Something worse. The constant, grinding technical precision of 200 years of experience run through the muscle and bone of an underfed academic in his late 30s. Every drill he demonstrated instead of describing. Every spar he took himself instead of handing to an assistant he didn't have. Every night alone on the field after the students went in. It was wearing out. He could feel exactly how fast and roughly how much was left, because knowing precisely what a body has remaining is one of the things 2 centuries teaches you, whether you want to learn it or not. He taught the next morning as though nothing had happened. The girl with the crimson eyes noticed. Of course she did. She noticed everything. That was half of what made her dangerous. She watched him through an entire lesson with her jaw set, and she said nothing, and he pretended not to see her noticing. That silence became a third presence in the room that neither of them ever acknowledged out loud. At night, alone on the field, he ran his own forms until he collapsed. And lying there on his hands and knees in the dirt at 2 a.m, staring up at a sky with no crack in it, he finally understood the thing he had been walking around for the better part of a year. He had assumed his mistake was tactical. Wrong lessons, wrong emphasis, praise given to the wrong instincts at the wrong ages, a correctable error, of the kind you fix by paying closer attention the second time through. It wasn't that. His 18 legends had all fought the same way. You can see it if you look at the old records, and he had, obsessively, for years, in the part of his life that came after the funerals and before the war. 18 different people. Different builds, different temperaments, different weapons, different backgrounds, recruited across 2 decades from opposite ends of the kingdom. All of them moving like the same man. Because that is what he had built. He had not trained 18 fighters. He had made 18 copies of himself and then sent them into a war that killed him. They didn't die because they were weak. They died because they were him, and he was mortal. And 18 copies of one mortal man is just one man dying 18 times over 9 days. He lay on that field for a long time. The next day he watched his 3 students train, and for once he watched them properly. Not for errors, for differences. The red-haired boy retreated, but not the way the instructor retreated. The boy gave ground in a tight, aggressive arc that kept his blade forward and the pressure on. Something the instructor had never taught and never would have invented, because it did not suit his own build at all. It suited the boy's perfectly. The healer had stopped bracing before she touched a wound. She had developed a habit of talking while she worked, steady, quiet, mostly nonsense about the weather or what she'd eaten that morning, and it was calming the person she was treating, and it was also calming her, and nobody had taught her that either. She had found it herself in the gap he left when he stopped instructing and started waiting. And the girl with the crimson eyes asked for help out loud, not with a gesture, not with a look, with words in a complete sentence in front of other people, and then she went straight back to work as though it had cost her nothing, which it very obviously had and always would. 3 students, 3 completely different fighters, not one of them fighting like him. He turned away so they wouldn't see his face. That evening he sat alone in the empty classroom with 3 bronze training tokens laid out in a row on the desk in the orange light from the windows. Then he took the broken one out of his coat, the one that had come with him across 200 years and 1 death, still snapped clean through the middle, and set it down beside the others. 4 tokens. 3 whole, 1 broken. He sat there until it was completely dark, and then he sat there a while longer. She waited until the other 2 had gone. That was deliberate. He knew it was deliberate the moment she didn't leave with them, because in 4 months he had never once seen that girl do anything by accident. The classroom was going orange at the edges. 3 bronze tokens sat on the desk in a row where he had left them, and a 4th beside them, snapped clean through the middle. She looked at the broken one for slightly too long. Then she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to not lie to me." "That's a large request." "You can refuse to answer. I prefer that to a lie." He put his pen down. "Ask." She didn't sit. She stood at the end of the desk with her arms at her sides, and when she spoke, it was in the flat, careful voice of someone who has rehearsed a thing and is determined to get through it without stopping. "Every drill you gave him was about retreating," she said. "Not footwork, not distance. Retreating, specifically, for 2 months, until he hated you. And it was the exact thing he needed, and none of the other instructors had ever noticed it in 4 years. He wasn't subtle about it. Let me finish. Sharp." He shut up. "Every task you gave her involved touching someone who was bleeding. Not healing, touching. And you cut your own hand to do it, 11 days in a row, when you could have used a training dummy or a volunteer or literally anything else." She paused. "And every single thing you have ever asked me to do requires a second person." The light went another degree oranger. "Not most things," she said. "Everything. 4 months. I checked. I went back through everything you've assigned me since the first week, and there is not one exercise on that list that a single person could complete alone. Not one. That's not a teaching style. That's a design." He didn't answer. "So here's the question." She looked straight at him. "You didn't diagnose us. You didn't watch us and work it out. You knew before you walked into that room, day 1, before you'd seen any of us fight." She let that sit. How? He had known this conversation was coming for approximately 3 months. He had run through perhaps 40 versions of it in his head, in the dark, on the training field at 2 in the morning, and every single version had ended in the same place, which is why he had never bothered choosing one. There was no answer he could give her, not because she wouldn't believe it. That was the strange part. He was reasonably sure she would believe it, eventually, because she was the kind of person who followed evidence wherever it went, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination was. The problem was what believing it would do to her, because the moment she knew there was a written future, she would ask what was written for her, and she would keep asking, and she would not stop because she never stopped, and he would eventually have to look a 16-year-old in the face and tell her that in the version of the world he came from, she burned a city down and 4 nations combined to put her in the ground. You cannot tell a person that, not because it's cruel, because it's load-bearing. Tell someone what they're going to become and you hand them a script. Some of them fight it. Most of them, eventually, quietly, start reading their lines. He had spent 200 years watching people become what they were told they were. "I can't answer that," he said. "Can't or won't?" "Both. Genuinely both, and I'd tell you which one if that helped, and it wouldn't." She absorbed that. He watched her run it. The tilt of her head, the small stillness, that terrifying processing speed working through the possibilities and eliminating them one at a time. "You're not lying," she said eventually. "No." "You're also not going to tell me." "No." "Ever?" "I don't know." That, at least, was completely true, and he thought she heard it. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something he hadn't predicted at all, which was rare enough by that point to be genuinely disorienting. She sat down. Across the desk from him, in the chair with the exercise sheets on it, which she moved to the floor without comment, and she looked at the 4 tokens. 3 whole and 1 broken, she said. Yes. The broken one's yours. Yes. You didn't get it here. He said nothing. She nodded slowly, as if a hypothesis had just been quietly confirmed and filed away without ceremony. All right, she said. All right? I'm not going to ask again. She stood up. Not because I've stopped wanting to know, because you've never once asked me for anything, and this is the first time you've refused me something, and I can work out what that means without being told. She went to the door, then, without turning around, whatever it is you're doing, it's costing you something. You think we haven't noticed. We've all noticed. He noticed before I did, actually, which should tell you how badly you're hiding it. His hand, resting on the desk, did not move at all. When you decide to tell us, she said, we'll be here. And she left. He sat alone in that classroom until the orange went out of the windows entirely, with 4 bronze tokens on the desk in front of him and a cough sitting at the bottom of his lungs like a stone. 200 years ago, he had trained 18 people who would have died for him without ever once asking what he was carrying. This one had asked in the 4th month. He put the broken token back in his coat pocket, and he thought, for the first time since he had woken up in a rented room with a stranger's face in the mirror, that he might have made a serious miscalculation about how much time he had left to finish this. A year later, she beat him. Not with power. She had more raw power than him from the first day they met. That was never the test, and both of them knew it. She beat him tactically, on the training field, in front of the other 2, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. He pressed her. She gave ground, 3 clean steps, that tight aggressive arc, the retreat she had learned from a red-haired boy who learned it from being forced to do the thing he hated most in the world. He followed. Following was correct. The pressure was working, the angle was good, she was giving up ground faster than she should have been. It was a trap. She had built it 4 exchanges earlier and let him walk into it using his own momentum as the mechanism. He hit the ground on one knee, and the point of a training blade stopped a hand's width from his throat. And then, for the first time in 200 years, he laughed. Out loud, in the dirt, with a 16-year-old standing over him and the other 2 staring like the color of the sky had changed. She held her hand out to him. He looked at it for a second longer than he needed to, at a hand extended freely, without being asked, by the girl who in another future never asked anyone for anything and never offered anything either, and who stood alone in the middle of a city she had burned while 4 nations gathered to kill her. He took it. And that was the exact moment the sky darkened. Not weather. Everyone on that field felt the difference immediately, in their teeth and in the small bones of the ear. The light went wrong in the specific way light goes wrong when something very large is being done to the world somewhere else. He turned around slowly, still holding her hand, and he already knew what he was going to see. He had seen it once before, from a ridge above a dying city at the end of a life. There was a crack in the sky. It was small. It was thin. It was 203 years too early. He stood there and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was very simple and very bad. He had changed 3 lives at the root. Those 3 lives touched dozens of others, classmates who trained differently because of what they saw in that arena, instructors who changed their methods, a top student who lost in public for the first time and had to build a new understanding of herself out of the wreckage. Every intervention had been propagating outward for 2 years. And somewhere in that cascade, something that was supposed to stay sealed for 2 more centuries had noticed that the shape of the world no longer matched the shape it had been promised. He had bought his students a future. He had also moved the war into it. Behind him, 3 16-year-olds were staring up at a broken sky, and none of them understood yet what they were looking at. And in about 4 seconds, one of them was going to turn and ask him. He stepped in front of them, old habit, completely useless habit, given what he was and what was coming through that crack, and he did it anyway, because 200 years had not managed to train it out of him, and neither had dying. His hand closed around the broken token in his pocket, and then something happened that he had not planned, had not taught, and could not have predicted. The girl with the crimson eyes stepped up beside him, not behind, beside. And when he glanced sideways at her, she was not looking at him for instructions. She was looking at the crack in the sky, and she was calculating. He could see her doing it, he had taught her how, and she was not afraid. A moment later, the red-haired boy moved up on his other side, blade already drawn, feet set in a stance that could give ground the instant it needed to. And the healer took the position behind all three of them, where she could see everyone at once and reach any of them in 2 steps. Which is exactly where she should have been, and which nobody had ever told her. 200 years ago, he had built 18 copies of himself and sent them out to die. This time, he had built something else. He was about to find out whether it was enough. Part 2 is already in the works. Subscribe and drop a like. Every like brings the next chapter faster. See you on the training field.